Monster Hunter Rise is the latest in the long-running Monster Hunter series, a series that has reached critical acclaim the world over. It is the culmination of 15 years of iteration and progress for the series and its compelling, award-winning formula. With the release of Primordial Malzeno and the final title update in June 2023, it is feature complete, and I feel that it can now properly be judged. And it's okay. That's the short answer. The long answer is that Monster Hunter Rise and its expansion Sunbreak do a lot of things well and a lot of things terribly. One second you can be totally engaged with an exciting dance to the death with an apocalyptic creature capable of reaming your tight little asshole 6 ways from Sunday if you mess up. And the next, wonder how the fuck anyone could find this fun. In fact, overall, I'd rate it below average on the list of Monster Hunter games I've played. Yes, I'm a tribabby. My mom was too poor to buy me a PSP for just one game. Deal with it. It's true that I haven't played the undisputed best game in the series, Monster Hunter DOS. The last real Monster Hunter, if you weren't aware. But I just want to be clear about the perspective I'm bringing. The opinions reflected here are my own. However, my opinions are objectively right, and if you disagree with any of them, you are wrong, and should play a game more fitting for your trash tastes. To be clear, this essay is mostly focused on how the game is, though I will in some instances talk about how the game was, mostly to provide context. I'm a personal believer that games should be judged after becoming feature complete. After all, when you go back and decide to play Thief, the Dark Project from the fine year of 1998, you're not going to go back and play the unpatched Thief and then everything that was added to the game. You're just going to play Thief Gold from the very start, and experience the game as it was when the developers stopped working on it. However, ever since Capcom started doing this live service bullshit, it's clear that, for all future titles, you're going to be buying a work in progress, and need to be aware of all that entails, to decide if it's truly worth your hard-earned money, or if you should just emulate DOS for free. It's a rhetorical question. The answer is always yes. Additionally, I'm going to evaluate Rise and Sunbreak as a complete package, because that's just the business model of Monster Hunter. Each game in the series gets an initial release, and then an expanded version with a lot of changes backported to the original game, mostly crucial balance changes. If a feature is exclusive to Master Rank, then I'll let you know my thoughts on that when I get to them, because some of them are kind of baffling. For general gameplay, Monster Hunter is one of those few games that's exactly what it says on the tin. There are monsters, and you hunt them. Rinse and repeat. As I'm approaching this from the perspective of a fan, I won't go into detail why Monster Hunter's core loop of kill monster, use its parts to make cool gear, go kill bigger monster is brilliant. It's more prudent to talk about the gameplay features that Rise introduces, and, in some cases, leaves behind compared to past games. This is especially important because I feel like Monster Hunter has entered what I call a late-stage franchise stagnation period, where the core gameplay has been perfected, and each game going forward will be dominated by a gimmick that will last for only one game before being replaced by something more wacky in the next one. See Pokemon for another example of this phenomenon. As a side note, I've noticed that this tends to happen when a game series drops numbers from the titles of its entries, but that's a conversation for another time. Rise introduces 4 primary changes in core gameplay: wirebugs, palamutes, wyvern riding, and followers. My thoughts on 3 of these can be summed up briefly, so I'll get those out of the way first. Palamutes are an interesting addition. They're a natural evolution of the Raideride concept from World, inherently better because you can actually control the thing. And it does its job, namely getting you from point A to point B quickly, which is very useful in this new age of map size bloat. They're mainly used as supplementary damage dealers as opposed to the utility provided by Palicos, but the defining thing about them is that they can be equipped with 2 gear items. This is a cool idea, except the devs don't really do anything with this. There are 2 items that actually give your Palamute some definition, being the shield parasol and the artificial jaws that let them clamp down onto a monster to tenderize the spot. Everything else is either some indiscernible flavor of do more damage, or in the case of the heal scrolls, functionally useless. It really is a missed opportunity to allow Palamutes to supplement combat, like maybe fetching a wirebug from time to time, or perhaps holding a mon still for a few seconds for the occasional easy opening. Basically, the goal would be to turn them less into DPS bots and more into damage enablers, with fewer but more impactful abilities than what Palicos possess. As it is right now, you'll probably just slap the same 2 pieces of gear on every dog you recruit. The Palamute skill system is also bare bones, as it often just boils down to finding the optimal combination of attack skills and slapping those onto every dog as well. Palicos feel like they suffer from this problem too, but they're saved by the sheer amount of meaningful variety and customization. Well, once you get to Sunbreak and break free from the whims of RNG when recruiting helpers, they offer. With Palicos, there's typically an optimal set of skills, but they're all different and still useful enough that you really don't lose much by going with one option over the other. They supplement the player as the player desires, and I just think that Palamutes could have used more of that, even if they were meant to be more damage dealers than utility. The Wyvern riding system is a replacement for the mounting minigame that has been a series staple since Monster Hunter 4. Back then, it was pretty simplistic, and even World's attempts to give it a bit more interactivity by letting you dance around the monster's body, which savvy players could even use to help break tough-to-hit parts by having the monster bash itself against a wall to try to knock you off of it, was an improvement, but still could have used some work, especially since Capcom already nailed the mounting giant monster system in Dragon's Dogma. For a company that is known for sharing code, animation data, and general talent around its teams, I find it strange that the Dragon's Dogma system was never even hinted at in Monster Hunter. Instead, it has been replaced by an entirely new minigame in Rise, which has some benefits and drawbacks. On one hand, the fact that it happens once, maybe twice per fight, that it's over quickly, and that it allows for the experience of controlling a monster to attack, are all great innovations and a marked improvement over just mashing a button until you hit an arbitrary threshold for a topple. However, this does lead to the whole thing feeling repetitive. Not so much the minigame itself, but what effect it has on the concept of invaders. Monster Hunter likes to send other monsters your way to interrupt a fight and add a bit of chaos to it. This is great, and having to balance a 3-way, unless you pay the dung bomb tax, and even then it doesn't always work, is exciting and intense. When you saw another monster waltz into the arena, it made your heart race, and forced you to completely reevaluate how you were fighting on the fly, until something left and you could breathe easy. However, in Rise, one of the ways to trigger a mount is by having monsters damage each other, and this triggers it almost instantly. I can see the logic. Part of the appeal of Wyvern riding is to be able to use monsters as weapons, and you want players to experience this frequently. However, you lose the element of excitement when monsters immediately stop fighting you, run over to give a love tap to the invader, and continue focusing on it until you mount and use it to kick the monster's ass. Due to the mechanics, the balance is heavily in favor of the player, so 95% of the time the ride will go flawlessly and you'll get the special finisher, after which the monster you rode leaves the arena. Even if you ignore the ride, the monster will leave anyway after it recovers from the vulnerable state. This may be my own preferences, but I don't think it's good that invaders can now be seen as free damage and just a total benefit to the player. It removes the excitement and unpredictability that can make for some of a Monster Hunter game's best moments. The next big thing that Rise introduced was the follower system, which I feel is a huge accomplishment by the devs. Monster Hunter is a very complex game, objectively speaking, and for AI to not only play realistically, but better than most players is a huge testament to the team's skill. Though they don't do a lot of damage, being able to actually learn timing and tricks from AI companions not only helps the player master their own weapons, but shows that the AI is smart enough to anticipate attacks and react accordingly in a game where there often isn't a single right or wrong answer that an AI could easily execute in the form of a routine. The companions are also cool, distinct, and most of the time meaningful characters to hunt alongside with, and even react to player actions that you'd think wouldn't garner any notice. I actually did a double take when I decided to, on one hunt, attack some peaceful herbivores for shits and giggles, and Fiorain said, "What's wrong with you?" in an accusatory tone. However, as good as they are, the system still has its kinks. You can swap weapons for each character, but other than giving them a hunting horn, you don't really see any change. If anything, their performance worsens because their armor sets remain fixed and can really cater towards their default weapon type. I think it would have been really cool to be able to equip them as the player sees fit. It would give a reason to craft armor one normally wouldn't give the time of day to, and allow you to cater how they supplement your fighting style, such as stacking paralysis or being a knockout king. However, it feels like the devs intended this system to be little more than window dressing. It's there to provide a voice during story missions, and even in the most optimal conditions, companions don't do more than 10% of a mon's health on an average hunt, being mostly defined by their unique quirks, at least the few that do have unique quirks with items or healing. Honestly, that's okay. Monster Hunter is a multiplayer game, and the companions are meant to be a backup rather than the primary way for doing quests. Overall, I think they're a fair substitute for the multiplayer experience, which is important because matching up with people is a lot more difficult than it should be. I'll get into that later, trust me. However, the system needs a bit of work in future titles, like making it available from the start. Of all the systems to backport, this would be the one. And at least giving more unique interactions between the characters so that the player is incentivized to mix and match rather than just picking the same 2 or 3 characters each time. Finally, the biggest change of all, and the defining gimmick of Rise: wire bugs and silkbind attacks. I'm going to be blunt. Hunter arts and their consequences have been a disaster for the hunter race. The idea of super moves can be traced back to generations, and silkbind attacks are simply hunter arts by another name, except worse. Hunter arts may have been overpowered, true, but the saving grace was that they were not designed to be spammable. You had to charge them up by inflicting damage, which inherently limited how frequently they could be used in a hunt. You had to engage with the game, and even then, they didn't change the way the game was played too much. Either they were a passive buff, or a super move that you pulled off when you had a humongous opening, functionally identical to a long combo of regular attacks. Of course, there was the absolute readiness skill, which was a get-out-of-jail-free card, but that was just insurance for if you messed up, and you had to sacrifice a more powerful hunter art to slot it into your move's loadout. Silkbind attacks, however, are designed to be spammable. They recharge via a simple time cooldown, and their utility blows even the most overpowered hunter arts out of the water. They are more powerful than normal moves by a high measure across the board, and many allow you to just flat out ignore the need for good positioning. One of the things that people like most about Monster Hunter, with very generous counter windows. You are meant to use silkbind attacks frequently, typically as soon as your bugs come off a cooldown, and the game design has shifted as a result of this. There are significantly more AoE and multi-hitbox attacks in Rise than there have ever been, and when people call it Counter Hunter, it is a name well deserved. There's nothing more soul-crushing than seeing a time attack run of your favorite weapon against your favorite monster and finding out that simply doing the same silkbind attack over and over and over again because anything else is a waste of time. Now, this sounds doom and gloom, but I will admit that silkbind attacks aren't necessarily all bad. Some of them can be pretty good when they're filling a niche that the weapon is lacking in and require serious consideration based on the desired playstyle of the hunter. Take, for example, my favorite, the Lance. Its 3 primary silkbind attacks are 1. An unbreakable counter that gives a temporary damage buff based on how heavy the absorbed attack is. 2. A less powerful counter that allows the hunter to zip around in 2 straight lines to reposition or to chase a fast monster. And 3. A complete non-counter that launches the hunter skywards before plunging down through the target, dealing more hits the longer the hunter is in contact with said target. These are all fairly different, and none really seem inherently more powerful than the others. You pick one based on what you feel would be the most useful tool for the specific target that you're fighting. This not only lends for further engagement on the player's part with how they fight, but also increases replayability for when you need to fight a monster a dozen times, because it just won't give you an 80% drop. Yes, I am speaking from personal experience. However, the Lance's case is the exception, not the rule, and for 90% of the Silkbind attacks in the game, there is one clear correct choice that is universally stronger, more useful, or just flat out cooler than the others. I feel like Silkbind attacks should have been more in the vein of Dual Blade's Ironshine Silk, which is a buff that lets you regain sharpness when iframing through attacks for an evasion-heavy weapon, and Switch Axe's Soaring Wyvern Blade, which allows you to add onto an already high-commitment normal attack chain that feels great to get off in and of itself. However, most Silkbind attacks are more in the vein of the Switch Axe's Elemental Burst counter and the Sword and Shield's Metsu Shoryugeki, which are one-size-fits-all counters that do obscene amounts of damage and turns optimal playstyle into just using those as much as possible. The most egregious of these is the Greatsword's Strongarm stance, which single-handedly propels it far and above every other Blade Master weapon in all respects. If you watch a Greatsword run on YouTube with even a moderate level of play, a solid majority of all damage dealt will come from this one move, which I find to be an utter failure of game design. Overall, I find Silkbind attacks to do more harm than good, and their inclusion shifts Monster Hunter away from its core identity. Too many of them don't meaningfully open up options that make hunts more fun, instead just acting as an I win button. As I mentioned before, they're so strong that the game design has shifted entirely based on their strength and utility. Monster HP values have never been higher in a mainline game, and even then, Frontier isn't ahead by that much anymore. And their speed and combo strings have risen to match the increased reactivity that Silkbind attacks afford the player. We could see the overall pace of gameplay getting faster and faster in Generations in World, but that felt like a gentle, reasonable creep compared to the huge shift that Rise brought. Now, don't get me wrong, increasing pace of play isn't a bad thing inherently, but in Rise, the player's pace is dictated by whether or not their wire bugs are charged. If they are, all's good. And if they aren't, then you're going to be having a rough time keeping up. It both directly and indirectly punishes the player for simply getting unlucky when the AI doesn't precisely align with your cooldowns, putting a cap on player potential and making you sometimes think, man, I wish I could do this right now, but my bugs are still on cooldown, so oh well. The prevalence of Silkbind counters takes away from weapon identity too, allowing every single weapon, sans Insect Glaive for some strange reason, to have a mechanic that was a defining trait of Longsword and Lance. The new mounting system builds up only from Silkbind attacks, and even Evade Window got a huge nerf, presumably to pigeonhole people into countering instead of dodging attacks. All of these mechanics suggest a very heavy commitment from the devs to this new system of a cooldown-based resource, and it troubles me to think just how cancerous it can get if this system isn't dropped in future games. Now, I'd like to talk about the more general changes that Rise made. In terms of the weapons, barring Silkbind attacks, I'd say that a lot of them have received changes for the better. While it's true that gunner weapons still significantly outdamage Blade Master weapons, and some weapon types do objectively lag behind in high-level play, many of the weapons are now roughly on par with each other in terms of damage output. Not only that, most of them have a much fuller toolset that opens up new play options, making bizarre playstyles such as Guard Sword and Shield and Elemental Greatsword strong enough to actually seriously play towards. There are some losers though. Switch Axe has reverted to its usual sword mode focus after a really nice balance in World, and although Hunting Horn got some great new moves, it came at the cost of utter bastardization by cucking it out of its proper song lists. Still, there's a much clearer mindedness towards balance, especially apparent with the devs' constant fiddling and tweaking of weapons and updates to try to fix issues and shortcomings that the community vocalizes. at which they were mostly successful. Even within a weapon type, there's a sense of trying to make everything good. At endgame, all weapons can be upgraded to a state that makes them comparable with each other, even those belonging to low-level shit mods, with the augment system further reducing the gaps between them. While it's true that certain combinations of traits are more advantageous, very rarely does it feel like there is one single best weapon in each category. Granted, there are some losers that lag behind, but these are a rarity compared to past games where everything except for the few chosen darlings were noticeably awful. And even then, they at least feel usable in some sense. Of course, number crunching autists will determine which weapon has the highest DPS, but if you look at their spreadsheets, the margins are very small and often matchup dependent. It's not like the 20% or more damage disparity between weapons like in past games. Even with title updates, I feel like the devs had a very good handle on power creep. Back in World, it felt like each successive title update just gave the player weapons and armor that were objectively superior to what came before, making 90% of the gear roster feel pointless. In Rise, while weapons and armor did trend higher and higher in terms of strength, they didn't completely invalidate what came before. Rather, weapons felt more geared towards opening up more options to the player, with weapon-specific perks, and new, cool armor skills that had their own niches and caveats. If you look at a list of the damage meta for a particular weapon, odds are you're going to find healthy representation from a wide variety of monsters. The fact that these meta sets always got big shakeups with each title update is a testament to the careful balancing act that the devs walked. However, I do have to note that the devs were much better at balancing weapons than they were at balancing armor skills. A lot of Rise's skills, particularly towards the end, are what people like to call one-point wonders. They're called that because, if you look at the hard numbers, oftentimes you don't get much more benefit by maxing out the skill compared to just slotting in a single point of it. For most of these one-point wonders, having a single point opens up the unique mechanic, and being able to access it at all is typically where most of the power comes from. This means that, by the end, good sets will have an obscene amount of skills, inflated by the number of skills where people just put in a single point for maximum gains per point. The transition from the old skill system to the new one continues to be rocky, but I do think that, no matter how you cut it, power should require commitment. A hunter shouldn't be good at everything. They should be forced to pick and choose what skills they want to base their playstyle around. I'm not against the idea of one-point wonders. After all, splashing a skill can open up the possibility of fun and creative synergies, but I think that the attitude should be that the player should be incentivized to max out skills to strongly define their playstyle. A philosophy of fewer, stronger skills should be the norm, especially considering almost all skills now exist on a scale of 1 to 3 points. Frankly, I think that a better system would be making everything exist on a scale of 1 to 5 points, or even 1 to 7 like attack boosts and critical eye, with higher levels granting exponentially more strength for each point. There are a few that follow the mold where you need to max them out to get the greatest effects, but they're few and far between. I feel like this is a fair compromise, especially considering how many skill points players can pack onto their sets. Thankfully, Rise has reverted World's flip on decorations and charms back to the old system, where you can craft decorations and charms are randomly generated. This gives the player a lot more control over what skills they want, and as of right now, there's a clear and satisfying progression of power when it comes to charms. For much of the game, they're treated as a small bonus, and by the end, it's very easy to acquire one that is quote-unquote top tier for your particular set. It's true that you seem to race through the final tiers of charm making, but I find that to be vastly preferable to a long and unforgiving grind, especially since the way endgame is structured, you'll need to be shitting out loads of damage to keep up with the massive HP bloat. The last thing I want to talk about in terms of armor skills is the curious crafting mechanic. At endgame, Rise has a mechanic where you can roll various skills on your armor sets. For this, I feel really mixed. On one hand, it's a reason to craft more than one armor piece, something that the player has never had any incentive to do before. On the other, it not only homogenizes armor sets, but also makes getting the skill you want completely up to chance, and a very low one at that. Every single skill, aside from a scant few, can be rolled onto armor pieces, including the signature abilities of some monsters that lack decorations. Again, I've always been a proponent of the player needing to make difficult choices with no right answers, and being able to put nearly any skill on any piece just takes away from that. Armor with the most powerful skills isn't always optimal, and you should have to make the most of that if you want that particular brand of power. As it is now, armor more or less just becomes defined by the amount of skill points that you can slap onto it. Not only that, the actual melding process is utterly mind-numbing. It really does feel like I'm some old boomer in Vegas just pressing a button on a slot machine over and over and over again. More than a few times, I've had to roll upwards for half an hour to get the skill that I wanted. And multiply that by 5 to fully kit out a set. They can't even make it fast and easy by letting you just mash X to keep rolling, and instead you have to manually select which crafting material you want to use every single time. It isn't fun, it isn't engaging, and all you feel at the end is relief that you don't have to do it anymore. That is, until you want to make another set. Either make the crafting process deterministic, or limit the selection of skills to be only those that give general quality of life, like item prolonger or recovery speed. You know, the things where it would be nice to have if you rolled them, but no real big loss if you decided to go without. That way, curious armor crafting would be something that you did every so often to kill a few minutes while you waited for people to join your lobby, or to do a bit of unwinding at the end of a play session. As it is now, it is an awful gotcha that is both annoying to engage with and harms player choice. Of course, as much as people like to say that Monster Hunter is just playing dress up for boys, while they're completely right, ultimately the gear defines how players engage with the monsters. They're important enough to be in the title of the game, so a lot of care and effort must be put into them, right? Right! The monsters of Rise are all pretty fun fights for the most part. The Mons have a high variety of body types, including several that are completely new. There is a healthy roster of monsters, which keeps the gameplay experience varied and feeling fresh. In addition to highly unique traits and gimmicks, nearly every monster has state changes, which either end in the form of an ultimate attack, or by being broken by player damage. This used to be one of Zinogre's defining traits, but it seems to have been wholeheartedly embraced in general monster design. I'm not complaining. It gives fights a nice sense of flow where the player gets a meaningful reward for doing well in the form of weakening the monster. It's not always used, so it doesn't feel samey. Just enough to make a few notable fights just that much more exciting. GaaS Harag in particular feels great to fight against because his weakest parts are his most dangerous. And he even has a unique trait of walking towards you slowly, like Michael Myers if you get stunned, to deliver a coup de grace. It is so cool. Very few fights are downright bad, though Almudron is exceptional to the point where his subspecies, which almost always improve the fight, can't save him from being a slog. Still, the proportion of bad fights to good fights is heavily weighed in the latter's favor, and I'd love for several monsters introduced in Rise to become series staples. However, just because they're fun fights doesn't always mean they're challenging fights. Rise does have a problem where most of the roster does lean more towards the easy side. With the amount of tools, mobility, and, unfortunately, countering options, the monsters do feel like they lag behind. Even at endgame, where their health and attacks are ratcheted up to ridiculous levels, only the highest of the high-level monsters will really push you to play at your best. And that's only because the high level monsters are so fast and strong that they can easily combo you from full health to faint if you don't respond correctly to what they're doing. I don't quite agree that this is necessarily a healthy approach to difficulty. In past games, difficulty came from losing the war of attrition. You lost not because you'd be one-shot if the AI rolled a chain of attacks that put you in a disadvantageous position, but because attacks hit hard and often enough that you'd run out of healing before the end. With this new design paradigm that lets players restock infinitely during a hunt, I suppose that losing a war of attrition is no longer possible. I do hope that future entries will have restock restrictions in place, at least for high-level hunts, so that monsters can be designed without feeling pressure to include one-shots and crazy combos just because that's the only way they can be truly threatening. In terms of everything surrounding the monsters, Rise does feel like a mixed bag. Nobody plays Monster Hunter for the story, but I feel like Vanilla Rise is especially awkward in this respect. Rise was supposed to be a return to having a village-guild split, but Village feels incredibly underdeveloped. People ragged on World because of its lack of a special Village questline, making it so that all players had to experience the in-engine cinematics on their own before they could join others and be joined. And rightfully so. It was an awful system that made playing through the story with friends an utter nightmare. In-engine cinematics and special events made sense when you could guarantee that there was only one player. But Rise's Village doesn't really do anything special. All of the monster introduction cinematics are presented as video segments before the quest starts, which is an elegant solution to the multiplayer issue, but removes the delightful experience of seeing your character have a short tussle with a new monster to introduce them, and what they're all about. There is only one unique cutscene in Village, which feels more like a part of the game's introduction than anything else. There is no unique Village final boss, and credits roll when you're just over halfway through, where nothing is really resolved. It genuinely makes me think that Rise's Village was a last-minute addition caused by the backlash from World's lack of it due to its lack of care and quality. However, I do think the ability to boost your hunter rank in Village is a great change. In past games, even if you completed Village before touching the multiplayer component, you'd still have to start from the bottom and work your way up again. In Rise, if you're not doing parallel progression, you can just do a special quest to put you right at the point where you'd start to see new stuff. It's a nice touch that keeps the player always pushing forward no matter what order they do things in. Keep in mind that this issue is only for Vanilla Rise. Once the player beats the base story and gets to Sunbreak, the game once again goes full world-style guild-only story, but done much better due to the aforementioned pre-quest cinematics, and the overall more laissez-faire approach to joining others for plot progression. As for the rest of the game, I think it's well structured. You now have a choice in which key quests you can do to progress, which gives the player a bit of freedom for which monsters they fight. Of course, 90% of players are going to clear them all before moving forward, but the fact that the choice is there is nice. I also think that gear requiring fewer materials across the board is also a good change. Grinding isn't fun. Fighting monsters is fun. It feels nice to be able to make a new weapon or piece of armor after your first kill. It makes the item feel like a trophy, some proof of victory that you can wear proudly. Granted, doesn't always happen, and rare materials do serve as big gates that often require several hunts to obtain. But overall, I feel like there's a good balance between ease of acquisition and incentivizing fighting the monster several times in order to assist others in a similar situation. For the food system, I do think that while dangos look utterly unappetizing compared to the lavish banquets of past games, the system where you're able to pick the skills that you want without having to worry about eating for stat boosts is much better for actual play. Let's be honest, nobody ever ate for defense or elemental resistance, so doing away with those entirely is no big deal. I especially like it when the player gets to Sunbreak and unlocks Hopping Dangos, a system where skills now exist on a spectrum of ranks, and you can select 2 boosted skills and 1 penalized skill for your Dangos. This is a great system for players to carefully weigh what they value and what they could go without, and if you ask different players what their Dango staples are, you'll rarely find the same answers between them. The maps themselves are okay. Again, I feel like the backlash of World influenced Rise's design philosophies. In this case, World's cluttered, terrain-heavy maps have been overcorrected by turning every map into a series of flat, sprawling arenas. It's this huge size that necessitated the introduction of palamutes in order to get around without having to roleplay as Usain Bolt whenever a monster flees. It also still sucks how monster AI is still shackled to individual zones. I think that people would complain significantly less if monsters could actually fight in the connecting paths, and let the fight gradually and organically move them around the map. I'm not against the idea of maps being divided into zones, I just think that the devs should stop chaining monsters to them. It immediately takes me out of the game when a monster suddenly drops everything in the middle of a fight to turn around and walk back to the center of the arena if it veered into a hallway. And it's something that needs to be axed in future entries if Capcom wants to further sell the illusion that monsters are living, breathing animals. That being said, a lot of the maps are visually varied and functional enough to immerse the player in a given environment. The only maps I'd say are outright bad are the Citadel and Lava Caverns, both visually gorgeous maps, but ones with a lot of wasted space, and are awful to traverse, even with all the camps unlocked. Still, I do appreciate the inclusion of hidden messages in every map to incentivize exploring around and seeing spots that are clearly not meant to host a fight. They're a nice little bonus that reward the player with a small story, and some simple decoration for the player's home. Even though player housing decoration has been completely gutted from World, it's a nice little touch. These messages are vastly superior to forcing players to go off the beaten path for Spira Birds, another questionable innovation. The toughest fights seem balanced around hunters having maximum or near maximum possible HP, so you'll eventually need to engage with the mechanic if you want to reliably survive the strongest attacks. Of course, if you're truly skilled enough, then they aren't needed, but you'll still have that ugly gray addition to your health and stamina bars. They do nothing but add a chore to the start of the hunt. First go on your bird route, then you can fight the monster. The devs have gone on record saying that they were implemented as an incentive to explore, but the messages, rare harvest materials, and endemic life, which unfortunately have been relegated to single-use items, so gone are the days of turning your room into an utter zoo like in World, already do a good job of that. If the flow of hunting was something like in World where you do long marathons on a single map, and the bonuses remained in between quests as long as you didn't return to base, I could see them having the intended effect of gradually ramping up the player's power. However, Rise is a very instanced game, most likely to facilitate its main goal of being the portable entry in the 5th generation of Monster Hunter. As it is now, collecting Spira Birds is something that you'll be doing a lot, and its novelty wears off very quickly. In everything I've said so far, I've avoided mentioning the one thing that Rise marketed heavily before release and prided itself on as a radical new way to play Monster Hunter. That being the new Rampage mode. Rampage was sold as a new way to play, where you'd have huge siege weapon structures that could be used to repel hordes and hordes of monsters. It wasn't a surprise to most people that this mode turned out to be a glorified form of tower defense, but people seemed to still be willing to give it a chance. As someone who ended up playing 50 quests for the achievement, I can safely say that the game mode is really half-baked. It's something that definitely sounds cooler in theory than it actually is in practice. I think the main trapping of Rampage is how monotonous it all is. Every Rampage plays the same. In regular hunts, each monster is unique and engaging on its own terms, and can provide a great gameplay experience. In Rampage, monsters exhibit one of 3 behavioral patterns, and are functionally identical within them. No matter whether you're fighting an Arzuros or a Rajang, the answer is always the same: sit your ass on a turret and shoot. Sometimes you press a button to brace for an attack. Then, after some time has passed, you gain an arbitrary power boost and can actually use your weapons to deal damage. I have to laugh at just how out of nowhere the power boost is. Almost as if it's there because troglodytes think big number equals fun. You do this 2 more times, there is literally no reason to do the shorter rampages, and then fight the boss monster at the end. The boss monsters themselves are fun fights, But it's just insulting how, no matter how well you've performed, they're always going to break the first barrier and move on to the final zone. Not to mention, the fights are over in a flash because of the frequent arbitrary power-ups in the final battle. Thank God the Rampage bosses can be fought as individual quests after you've killed them once, since you can actually fight them in a real hunt without any of the bullshit that Rampage brings to the table. I feel like the devs realized at some point in development how monotonous Rampages could be, because they give the player randomly generated objectives that they need to do in order to boost their score. These objectives take time to accomplish, but are trivial, which makes them feel more like chores rather than fun submissions. The only exception to this is the Repel Magnum Malo submission, which does force you to prioritize targets on the fly and pay really close attention to what's going on. However, you get this submission only once in a blue moon, and nothing else comes close to it. You'd think that, for such a tall order from the player, Rampage would give all sorts of rare and valuable materials. But you'd be wrong there as well. You get a hodgepodge of monster materials at the end, which means you can't even multitask and target what you need for weapon and armor upgrades. And the Rampage boss monster materials are mostly used for a single special weapon line in each category, whose gimmick is that you can put several augments on them instead of just one. There are special tickets that you use to augment normal weapons, which can occasionally have some fun and cool choices that go beyond simple attack boosts. However, this system, and Rampage in general, is thoroughly abandoned once the player hits Sunbreak, so now there's absolutely no reason to play Rampage beyond the ones required for the story. Rampage sucking is not a hot take. If you ask most people, they're glad that it vanishes completely once you hit Sunbreak. You have no reason to go back. Unless you're an autist like me who won't rest until he gets every single guild card award, of course. However, I find the willingness to just completely forget that it ever existed is a failure in and of itself. The devs didn't even try to fix Rampage. The idea isn't bad in theory. The devs just needed to respond to common feedback and do some playtesting to get a Rampage mode that felt nice. They even had the convenient excuse for not needing to backport the changes, saying that these changes were a result of unique quirks of a Curio-induced Rampage, or based on how Elgato had set up a defensive line. I'm not going to begin a discussion on how to fix Rampage mode, as that is a rabbit hole that I'm frankly not willing to get into. The devs are the ones earning paper by coding our digital crack. It's on them to suss it all out. When Monster Hunter Tri introduced water combat, it did not have a good reception. 3 Ultimate, however, brought it back, despite Portable Third having gotten rid of it completely. It wasn't simply an obligation because Sedeus was a strictly underwater fight, as the 2 crowning fights of that game, Dire Morales and Abyssal Lagiacrus, had heavy underwater combat emphasis, with the latter being done entirely underwater. When it was brought back, though, it had tweaks and adjusted controls such that, while still not fantastic to play, made it significantly easier for the player to deal with. I still think that it's a shame that it was not continued to be iterated on in future entries, but Rise didn't even have the decency to give Rampage a second pass. This means that the Rampage weapon line and the ramp-up augment system is discarded completely once you hit Sunbreak. I think that a weapon that was highly customizable was a great idea, and the ramp-up system was just flat out better than what Sunbreak introduces. Weapons could have unique perks that could further give them an edge beyond simple numbers. Personally, in Vanilla Rise, my greatsword of choice was the Diablos Greatsword. Not because it was the meta choice, but because I felt the unique bonus of regaining sharpness on block synergize with my use of the guard tackle. It added a fun element to picking weapons to use. But this is all gone once you hit Sunbreak in favor of generic interchangeable perks that you can just slot into a special decoration slot. Because they're interchangeable, most of them were nerfed to the point where it's often just best to slap in a generic damage boosting perk and be done with it. It's significantly less engaging than before, and I think the devs learned this lesson because most update weapons did have unique bonuses attached to them. However, it was too little, too late, and I hope that this philosophy of simply giving up on mechanics that weren't immediate hits changes in future games. And now, what will certainly be the most scathing part of my reflection. is the Anomaly system and the games as a service trappings that it embodied. On the surface, Anomaly monsters are just hyper versions of the existing monster roster that do more damage and have more health that you can fight after the story concludes to upgrade your weapons to their final form. This is a great idea that gives the player a reason to go back and fight shitmons now that they can actually pose a challenge. The game launched with only being able to fight up to mid-level monsters, which was strange, but not too offensive since it felt like the main purpose of Anomaly fights was to bring early to mid-level monsters up to the difficulty of later monsters. It was tremendously successful in doing this. The first title update, however, introduced Anomaly Investigations, which were repeatable quests that you could level up where monsters would get tougher, but the rewards would grow more and more powerful. This was the single biggest mistake that the devs ever made, and it's what kills Rise's endgame for the majority of players. It's tied to the system of augmenting weapons and armor, so there's no real way to avoid it if you want to bring out your full potential. The initial offering was mostly inoffensive. The levels spanned from 1 to 100, bracketed in levels of 20. You could not join anything higher than your player rank bracket, which was an odd choice, but you leveled up at a steady pace, and there were only 5 brackets. Once you hit rank 81, you could play with everyone, which is always the desired benchmark to hit in a multiplayer game. It was a goal that wasn't too difficult to hit, even though such regimented brackets meant that you could annoyingly be one level away from being able to play a much higher level quest, and the bands of how far and how low you could play without significant penalty was like 40% of the entire process. It was bad, but reasonable. Especially since at this point, weapon and armor augments were very small bonuses that you didn't lose much out on if you decided to simply ignore them. However, with each update, the Anomaly cap grew higher and higher, and it became tougher and tougher to rank up. Weapon and armor augments became ever stronger, and it wasn't that long until augmented weapons and armor were significantly more powerful than unaugmented ones, even from the monsters that came in updates. As I've said before, the devs were actually very good at controlling power creep from the actual monsters. There was a general trend for more strength, but not even the final update's monster, Primordial Malzeno, gave anything close to the end-all be-all gear offered by Fatalis in World. However, this was just an illusion. The power creep was still there, just in another form. Each time the game was updated, it crept further, without any real goal or purpose. No monster or other challenges added in the updates were strong enough to truly need the massive power bestowed by augments, and thus your reward for fighting Anomaly monsters and ranking up was fighting yet more Anomaly monsters. Not even different ones, as you unlock all monsters in Anomaly Investigations fairly early on. Once you hit rank 121 out of now 300, you've basically seen it all. Words can't even begin to describe how big a detriment this lack of a coherent vision was on the game. Above all, the bracketing system was disgustingly restrictive. When I say brackets of 20, I'm not saying that a rank 58 player could join a rank 78 quest. No, he was instead in the bracket ranging from rank 41 to 60, meaning the rank 58 player could only play quests up to level 60. And, upon reaching level 61, he could then play up to level 80 quests. Repeat all the way into the 200s, where it is only after the player gets to rank 221 that the bracketing system is finally abandoned and you can play quests all the way up to the maximum. With Rise's terrible lobby searching system, this makes it a huge struggle to play with players of your bracket. Higher ranked players can fortunately level down their quests to allow their non-poop-socking friends to join, but this was a feature that took a while to be added. For about half the time Sunbreak was being actively updated, you were just out of luck if you didn't have anything in the correct bracket. Not only that, even when you did, with such a huge span of ranks, you're going to likely be getting a severely reduced experience payout for it due to the level disparity. But, get this! The experience reduction is entirely arbitrary. I could somewhat understand if there was a huge power gap,
but the monsters get stronger at such a slow rate that you will barely notice it. The only hard numbers that I'm aware of is that over the span of quest level 100 to 200, the total increase in health, strength, and speed is 12%. 100 ranks for barely double-digit difference. By this logic, you should be getting 88% experience from joining a level 100 quest as a rank 200 player. But instead, not only will you get a mere 20% payout, it also feels like your material awards are cut as well. It is absolutely ridiculous how much the game indirectly penalizes you for trying to help out lobies. The guiding lands from World got a lot of flack as an endgame, and rightfully so. But the devs of World knew that, in a multiplayer game, there should be as few barriers to cooperation as possible. In World, not only did you rank up faster, all you needed to do were 2 quests to unlock the entire region, and then hit Master Rank 100, and that at that point, you could play with anybody. It was even less of a tall order to get to that crucial milestone when you consider that the story starts you out at Master Rank 24 at Endgame. And, unlike Rise, anything extra you did during the story counted towards it. Even if you played with people that weren't Master Rank 100 yet, you weren't penalized for it. You still got the same materials at the same rates as you normally would. It's just that the pool of possible monsters was shallower. Besides, you often needed a ton of variety in materials, so you'd be almost certain that you'd end up needing the stuff at some point. It made playing with lower ranked players satisfying and mutually beneficial, and you got the warm, fuzzy feeling of helping the lobby make substantial progress towards their ultimate goals, since it didn't require that many play sessions to get to where you needed to be if you were playing smartly. In contrast, the grind through Anomaly ranks is absolutely insane no matter how you cut it. The devs seem to have realized this and have massively boosted experience gain in the lower ranks, to the point where a good quest with even a few challenge modifiers can give you 3 to 4 ranks per quest, as opposed to the 1 at best they used to give. Even so, it just feels like a huge waste of time to revisit the lower ranks to help friends or get materials for the starting levels of augmenting. The inability to downmeld parts like in World's Guiding Lands also feels like an underhanded way to try to stealthily force people to play the lower ranks. But it is a half measure because not only can you outright buy lower ranking parts after a certain point, but only the lowest ranking tiers, so mid-level and above you have to endure the same penalties. But by that point, you're probably strong and experienced enough that it would be faster to just fight the monster solo, especially with the companionship of one or more of your many AI hunting companions. Not to mention, with the way the new quest RNG is weighted, you'll eventually settle into bouncing between the 2 highest classes of monsters, which means that, at high levels, you'll end up fighting a very shallow roster. Not that you'd fight anything lower unless you absolutely needed to, because the experience disparity between a risen Elder Dragon and even high-tiered normal monsters is absolutely jaw-dropping. If you go into a room and expect some casual hunts, you'll never see anything in the lower 2/3 of the roster. Even if you yourself post it, unless it's an explicit turns room, the other hunters are likely to just ignore it due to it not being worth the effort. You can't even use the in-game matchmaking like you should because of baffling region lock and rank limitations that make me wonder if it was even play-tested. What's confusing to me is that if the stars align and you do have success in the mid-quest matching, you are rewarded for it. The 20% boost in experience payout isn't nearly enough to counteract the level penalties, but the fact that it's even there is mind-boggling. You'd think that a multiplayer game would try to encourage groups to party up for longer play sessions, chatting, showing off fashion and hunting strats, and goofing off together. There is even the ability to exchange guild cards as mementos of memorable encounters. You know, making the multiplayer feel more human instead of matching you with soulless randos who you'll probably never see again. It genuinely made me long for the chaos of World's 16-player lobbies, because you could at least see and interact with other groups between quests, even if you were doing some solo grinding. The crowning cherry on top of the shit sundae is the complete and utter lack of a satisfying reward for those who grit their teeth and grind it out to the very end. Your reward is the ability to do what are called special investigations, which also require a given quest to be at its max level, and promise the toughest challenge yet, with new moves and AI. This is an outright lie. If anything other than the strongest of Mons get new moves, they are so rare and minor that they're functionally ignorable. The new moves are more apparent on the toughest of the roster, but even then, you can see a lot of these new moves below the rank cap. And your reward for all of this, for putting up with this ridiculous grind and unsatisfying fights? Just a simple mark on your guild card, tucked away in your monster list. No final tier of augments, no ridiculous super weapons, or armor that makes you look like a walking eyesore just to show off. You get a stamp in a place where hardly anyone's gonna look. That's it. Though, I never expected there to be a significant reward. After all, with how much time and energy it requires to get to max rank, I doubt the devs ever really intended for people to get to it. Why waste precious time and resources developing something that only 0.001% of players, at best, will see? This whole endless carrot-on-a-stick mentality that defined the game's endgame for most of its life, and still does, just to a lesser extent, is a hallmark of the dirtiest 4 words in modern gaming: games as a service. I feel that a lot of Rise's problems can be traced back to this philosophy. It seems that a lot of multiplayer-oriented games these days ascribe to this, and World and Rise are both no different in this respect. World time-gated a lot of its post-launch material, and with Rise, the faucet was cranked to give only the slightest of drip feeds. I'm not entirely sure which is worse, but based on Rise's aforementioned lack of planning and foresight with its Anomaly grind, I'm thinking it's the latter. But hey, at least event quests are permanently obtained. That sounds good, until you realize that all of the fun events where you get a bizarre new weapon, or it has unique gimmicks, like the monster being the size of a Pomeranian, are gone. Now, whenever a new event quest goes up, all you can expect is some possible layered gear, or even worse, guild card titles. To be fair, the layered gear is good, even if it's mostly ported armor from Frontier. What puzzles me is that most of the work is already done once a piece of gear has a model. Is it really that difficult to assign some skill points to it and make themed gimmick armor sets that are at least fun to mess around with? The conspiracy theorist in me makes me think that Capcom has a team of psychologists on call to calculate the exact amount of new stuff to keep players playing for the longest time possible, because that's all that seems to matter these days. The fact that so many games share arbitrary RPG elements makes me think that this is just some calculated, optimal psychological trick to keep people playing, because the longer people play, the more likely that they're going to buy microtransactions. When it comes to microtransactions, Rise has an absolutely obscene amount. I thought it was disgusting in World, but Rise's innovations really take the cake. Nearly everything has some form of monetization, be it layered armor, layered weapons, music tracks, hairstyles, you name it, you can probably buy it. As of this writing, Rise has around 250 utter wastes of hard-earned money for sale, costing so much that the Steam page doesn't even give the total for the entire lot. 250 items that could have been cool rewards for event quests that would make people excited to hop on every Wednesday to see what new shit they'll be getting. Thank God none of them actually have any gameplay influence, but who knows how long that'll last. I mean, I'm all for idiots essentially subsidizing the substantial updates that the game has received, but this is a slippery slope that makes me retch whenever I see people online with paid cosmetics. They are part of the problem and enable this offensive behavior. They are the reason why the devs implemented this Anomaly grind so that you just play forever. They are the reason event quests don't give fun rewards anymore. As long as they can get you to buy a single item, then it will have all been worth it. The only DLC I have ever purchased in Monster Hunter have been the actual expansions themselves. You know, the only thing that's actually worth the money. And I recommend you do the same. Don't give them an inch, because you can be sure as shit they'd charge you for EXP boosters or rare item drops if they think they'd be able to get away with it. It's a disgusting practice, and one that I feel is the main root behind the glaring problems with Rise's endgame, and will almost certainly cause problems for all Monster Hunter games going forwards. Just something to keep in mind when they try to sell you the world successor with Lagiacrus or Ignactor or whatever millennial nostalgia they can crap out for a flashy trailer. In conclusion, Monster Hunter Rise. It's a fun game, but it has huge problems. Though, now that I think about them, I feel that my apprehensions are less about what's actually in the game, and more about what it says about future games. Just looking at 4U, to Generations, to World, to Rise, there are some very worrying trends that are slowly sapping away what made Monster Hunter such a unique series. Do I recommend Monster Hunter Rise to other people? Yeah. The formula is still there, and Monster Hunter still has a certain je ne sais quoi that imitators just constantly fail to capture. I mean, what else is out there in the boss rush hunting genre? Wild Hearts? Fucking Dauntless? All the problems I talked about, those two games in particular have the same, except 10 times worse. Don't get me wrong, Monster Hunter Rise is still a good experience and is still one of the best bang for your buck games on the market. But it has enough significant problems that it's held back from being something truly fantastic. I expect I'll feel similar about the next Monster Hunter game, when all's said and done. All I can hope for is that it still provides enough good stuff to outweigh all the garbage. And boy, when you're as autistic and completionist as me, that's a lot of garbage.